Helen and George Whitmore were married for 47 years, but behind their quiet life in Cedar Falls was a secret so dark it took nearly 4 decades, and the FBI, to uncover it. George hadn't just lost their son, David. He had buried him. Helen. Whitmore never imagined her life would become a story people whispered about in coffee shops or followed online with disbelief. For nearly 5 decades, she had lived quietly in the modest town of Cedar Falls, Iowa. She and her husband, George, were the kind of couple others described as solid. They'd married young in the late 1970s, bought a small two-bedroom home on a sleepy street lined with maple trees, and built a life centered on routine, stability, and one deep love. Their only son, David, George worked for the Postal Service. For 35 years, he was the kind of man who followed rules, never called in sick, and brought home the same kind of sandwich every day for lunch. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. Helen, on the other hand, was warm and well known in the community. She helped out at the church, baked for charity events, and always seemed to remember everyone's birthday. Together, they seemed unremarkable in the most comforting way, just another long-married couple with matching lawn chairs and decades of shared memories. David was born in 1967 and quickly became the center of their world. He was a quiet boy, more interested in books than sports, but he was polite, smart, and deeply loved by both of his parents. Helen would often say that her happiest days were when David would sit at the kitchen table doing his homework while she made dinner. He had dreams of going to college out of state, maybe even becoming a writer. He had been accepted to a university in Chicago, and though Helen was proud, she was also anxious. George had been less supportive. He believed in hard work and staying close to home. The idea of David leaving didn't sit well with him, and it caused more than a few arguments during that summer. Then, in September of 1984, everything changed. David vanished. According to George, David had walked out after a heated argument about money and never came back. Helen had been out volunteering that day and returned home to find George sitting silently in the living room. When she asked where David was, George simply said he had left. At first, Helen believed it was just a teenage outburst. Maybe he needed some space. But hours turned into days, and days into weeks. The police were contacted, flyers were posted, and the local news covered the story with sympathy. But there were no clues, no sightings, no phone calls, no body. It was as if David had simply evaporated. For years, Helen waited. She left the porch light on every night and kept his room untouched. She refused to believe he was dead, while George seemed to close off entirely. He spoke about David less and less until he never mentioned him at all. Helen tried to keep the hope alive, but over time, even she had to accept that something terrible had likely happened. The years passed. George retired. They grew older. Helen threw herself into community work, while George spent more time in the garage, tinkering with old tools, or sitting silently by the radio. They celebrated anniversaries, attended funerals, watched neighbors move away. To outsiders, they were simply an old couple who had lived through a tragedy and quietly endured. What Helen didn't know, what she couldn't have guessed, was that their quiet life was built on a lie. That for 47 years, she had been sleeping next to a man who held the darkest secret imaginable. All that time, she thought she was grieving beside someone who had also lost a child. But the truth was far worse. George hadn't just failed to protect their son. He had been the one to take him away. She would only find out after George's health began to fail, when a dusty box buried deep in the basement set off a chain of events no one in Cedar Falls could have predicted. What started as a life of routine and shared sorrow would unravel into a horrifying story of deception, control, and the quiet evil that can live unnoticed in the most ordinary places. It was early October when Helen decided to start clearing out the basement. George had suffered a minor stroke the previous month, and though he was recovering at home, his movement was limited. The doctors had warned it might be the first of more to come. For the first time, Helen faced the possibility that they would not grow old together in the way she had always imagined. She wanted to get ahead of things, sort through the clutter, prepare for downsizing, and maybe even find a few forgotten treasures from the past. The basement had been largely George's domain over the years, filled with toolboxes, fishing rods, and crates of old hardware. She didn't expect to find much more than dust and spiderwebs. The air downstairs was stale and heavy, carrying that distinct smell of damp concrete and time. Helen moved slowly, opening boxes one by one, tossing out broken light fixtures and tangles of extension cords. Most of the items were familiar, remnants of their life together. But in the farthest corner of the basement, behind a disused shelving unit and beneath a crumbling plastic tarp, Helen noticed something different. It was a wooden box, old, weathered, and strangely out of place. It was heavy, too, as if it had been packed with care and forgotten deliberately. She wiped away the dust and opened the lid. Inside were several objects that made her stomach tighten. The first was a brown leather belt. It looked worn but intact. Embossed on the inside were the faded initials, D.W. David Whitmore. Her hands trembled as she held it. The second item was a small folding pocket knife, the kind David used to carry on camping trips. She hadn't seen it in nearly 4 decades. Then came the photographs. There were 6 of them. The first few seemed ordinary enough at first glance. Images of the forest, a clearing, what looked like the edge of a small wooden structure. But as Helen looked closer, something about them felt wrong. In 2 of the photos, there was a figure, a teenage boy, sitting against a tree. His face was half turned away, but Helen recognized the slouch of his shoulders, the dark hair. It looked like David. He wasn't smiling. His clothes looked rumpled, and in one picture, his hands appeared to be tied. Her breath caught in her throat. For a long moment, she just sat there, the photos spread across her lap, her thoughts racing without form. She didn't know what to think. Had someone sent these to George? Were they left by someone else? Was there some explanation she wasn't seeing? She placed everything back in the box and brought it upstairs. George was asleep in the living room recliner, a blanket over his legs and the sound of a game show playing low on the television. She didn't wake him. Instead, she sat in the kitchen and stared at the box until the sun went down. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, she took the box to the local police station. The young officer on duty didn't recognize her at first, but when she explained who she was and what she had found, his expression changed. He promised they would look into it immediately and that someone from the FBI's cold case unit might be contacted. Helen returned home shaken, but relieved. She had finally brought something forward, something real. Maybe it could lead to the truth about David. Days passed with no word, then weeks. Helen began to doubt herself. Maybe the photos weren't what they seemed. Maybe the belt and knife had simply been left there long ago and forgotten. But deep down, she knew better. Something about the way the box had been hidden, the condition of the items, it all felt intentional. Then, just as the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp with the first hints of winter, 2 black government vehicles pulled into her driveway. The agents didn't say much. They asked her to confirm where she had found the box, and then explained that the items had been sent for forensic testing. What they had discovered would change her life forever. That box, hidden and sealed for decades, had opened a door Helen never knew existed, a door into the darkest truth a mother could face. And soon, the full weight of that truth would come, crashing down on the life she had so carefully built around love, trust, and the memory of a son who, until now, she believed had simply disappeared. On a bitter November morning, just as frost began forming on the windows, Helen opened her door to find 2 FBI agents standing on her front porch. They wore dark coats and carried serious expressions. Without ceremony, they introduced themselves and asked to come inside. Helen led them to the living room, her hands trembling slightly, unsure of what she was about to hear. George was resting in the back bedroom, still recovering from his stroke, barely speaking, needing help with the smallest tasks. He had no idea the box had been found or that the FBI was now in their home. The agents didn't waste time. They told Helen that the photographs she'd found had been analyzed. Satellite mapping and environmental markers from the images had helped investigators identify the location. It was a dense forested area in northeastern Iowa, not far from where George used to go hunting years ago. That particular spot had once been home to a small, privately owned cabin that George and a friend had bought in the early 1980s. The structure was abandoned long ago and had since collapsed, leaving behind only traces, rotting beams, rusty nails, and, as the agents revealed, a shallow grave. Helen could barely breathe as they told her that forensic teams had discovered human remains beneath the cabin's remains. The skeletal structure was largely intact. Dental records and DNA analysis confirmed what she both feared and somehow already knew. The remains were David's. The revelation hit her like a tidal wave. For 39 years, she had clung to hope, imagining her son living another life somewhere far away. Maybe he had started over. Maybe he had just needed space. But now there was no more wondering. David hadn't run away. He hadn't disappeared into thin air. He had died there, in that forest, alone. The agents continued, their voices steady, but gentle. The belt found in the box had David's blood on it, traces that had remained after all these years. The pocket knife had George's fingerprints, and one of the photographs had partial prints matching both David and George. Time had worn away much of the physical evidence, but not all of it. The final piece came from the recovered bones. Tiny marks on the ribs and wrist bones showed signs of restraint, possibly rope or tight bindings. It suggested that David hadn't just died there. He had been held there, likely for days, before he was killed. That it was no accident. Helen listened in stunned silence as the agents laid out their findings. There were no other suspects. George had been the only one with access to the cabin. His hunting partner had died years ago and had never been in contact with David. No evidence linked anyone else to the scene. It was, as the FBI said, an intentional act carried out by someone David trusted, his own father. Helen felt the ground fall away beneath her. She thought back to that day in 1984, the day George told her David had walked out after a fight. He had been so calm, so certain. She had believed him because she trusted him. Because after nearly 2 decades of marriage, she thought she knew him. But all this time, he had known. He had buried the truth deeper than the body itself. And then, he had gone on living beside her, year after year, like nothing had happened. The agents left her with a written report and a list of resources, including grief counselors and legal contacts. Helen sat alone in the silence that followed, staring at the paper in her hands, struggling to connect the man asleep in the next room with the monster described in those pages. She had loved him, built a life with him, defended him when others questioned his coldness after David's disappearance. Now she felt nothing but horror. Later that day, she stood at the doorway of their bedroom and looked at George. He was thinner, now, paler, unable to speak clearly. He stared at the ceiling, unaware of what had unfolded just a few feet away. Helen didn't know if he still understood anything. She didn't know if he felt guilt or fear or nothing at all. But one thing was certain, he could no longer hide behind silence. The truth had finally come, and though it arrived decades too late, it brought with it the one thing Helen needed most, the answer to a question that had haunted her every day since her son vanished. The man she had trusted with her life had taken the life of the person she loved most, and nothing would ever be the same as the days turned colder. The house that had once felt warm with memories now seemed suffocating to Helen. Every room echoed with silence, But it wasn't the peaceful kind anymore. It was the kind that buzzed with secrets finally dragged into the light. The walls, the photos, the furniture, all of it now felt like part of a stage set for a lie she had unknowingly lived for nearly half a century. With each passing hour, the truth about George weighed heavier on her. What she'd believed was a shared grief had been a mask. The sorrow she saw in his eyes had not been for their missing son, but perhaps for himself, for the possibility of being found out. As the FBI investigation continued, more disturbing details surfaced. Investigators dug into George's past with fresh urgency. They tracked down medical records from his teenage years and discovered that he had been admitted briefly to a psychiatric facility after an incident involving violence toward a classmate. The records had long been sealed due to his age at the time, and George had never mentioned them, not to Helen, not to anyone she knew. He had lived his adult life appearing calm, collected, and utterly ordinary. But there were cracks beneath. The surface, cracks that had gone unnoticed because no one had thought to look. The FBI also found something else. Letters George had written but never sent. Tucked away in a box of old tax returns and papers in the garage, the letters revealed a side of George that was bitter, volatile, and paranoid. Some were addressed to David. They started off almost rational, warnings about the world, about college life, about the dangers of being too ambitious. But then they turned darker. He accused David of abandoning the family, of planning to shame him, of wanting to escape and never come back. The tone was erratic, shifting from pleading to accusatory in the same paragraph. It became clear to investigators, and to Helen, that George had been unraveling long before David disappeared. None of it made the truth easier to swallow. If anything, it made the betrayal deeper. George hadn't snapped in a moment of rage. He had planned, or at least entertained the idea of harming his son well before it happened. He had driven David to that cabin with full knowledge of what he was capable of. Helen now understood that the cabin had been more than just a hunting spot. It had been a place where George felt in control, away from the eyes of neighbors and family, far from suspicion. When the FBI asked if she'd ever suspected anything, Helen could only shake her head. George had never raised a hand to her. He had never shouted, never frightened her. But in hindsight, she began to recall subtle signs. How tense he became when David brought up leaving for college. How he avoided questions about that last day. How he never joined her in passing out missing person flyers or talking to reporters. She had chalked it up to grief, to the stoic way some men express pain. But now she knew better. He hadn't been grieving. He had been hiding. George remained in the care of a state medical facility under a protective order while the legal process began. But his condition worsened. The stroke had left him with limited speech and mobility, and within weeks, his health declined further. He never gave a confession. Whether out of inability or refusal, no words came. Helen never visited him. She couldn't bring herself to stand in front of him knowing what he had done. She had questions, so many, but there was nothing left to be gained from asking them. Word of the case spread quickly. What had once been a long cold missing persons file was now headline news. Neighbors, friends, and former classmates of David all reacted with disbelief. How could George Whitmore, the quiet man with the careful lawn and the steady job, have committed such a brutal act? But Helen no longer cared what the town thought. Her concern was no longer with appearances or judgment. It was with memory, with rebuilding the truth of her son's life and death. She began writing everything down. Every memory of David, every detail she had buried for years, trying to reclaim what had been stolen. Not just her son's life, but the truth of who he was. She reached out to the FBI to learn everything they had discovered. It was painful, but necessary. For the first time in decades, she wasn't clinging to false hope. She was clinging to facts, to reality, to justice, even if it had arrived too late. And in doing so, she began the slow, agonizing process of reclaiming herself from the shadow of the man she had loved and from the devastating silence he left behind. George Whitmore died quietly in his hospital bed just after sunrise on a January morning. There was no one at his side. No final words, no apologies. The official cause was complications from his stroke, but to Helen, it felt more like a slow disappearance. One more person fading into the shadows of a past that had already taken too much. The man who had shared her home, her bed, and her life for 47 years left this world without ever facing a courtroom, without ever answering for what he did. And yet, despite that lack of resolution, something shifted the moment he was gone. Helen didn't cry. She sat at the kitchen table that morning with a mug of coffee cooling in her hands, staring out the frosted window. The world looked the same. The quiet neighborhood, the leafless trees, the familiar hum of life outside. Nothing had changed. But inside her, everything had. The funeral was a simple, private affair. A few neighbors came, mostly out of politeness. No one mentioned David. Helen stood through it with numb detachment. She didn't wear black. She didn't speak. She let the moment pass like a chapter finally closing. Whatever George had been to the world, whatever mask he had worn for nearly 5 decades, she no longer had to carry it. She no longer had to wonder. After the burial, Helen returned home and began the long process of undoing a lifetime of shared history. She packed up George's things quietly and methodically. His clothes, his tools, the stack of old magazines. He kept beside his recliner. She donated most of it. The house felt lighter with each box that left. But it wasn't just a house now. It was a place filled with memories Helen could finally begin to sort through with clear eyes. She began visiting the small patch of land where David's remains had been reburied. The FBI had helped her arrange a proper burial near their home, in a cemetery shaded by tall pines. A modest gravestone marked the site. David Whitmore, beloved son. 1967 to 1984. Found at last. She would bring fresh flowers and sit quietly, letting the wind and birds do most of the talking. There were no more questions. No more wondering if he was still out there. What she had now was the painful truth, but it was truth. And that made all the difference that in the months that followed, Helen made a decision that surprised many people in her town. She agreed to speak publicly about her experience, not for attention, but to help others who were still living in the limbo she had endured for nearly 4 decades. She gave interviews, participated in forums for families of missing persons, and even met with investigators working on other cold cases. She spoke calmly, but with conviction. She urged people to keep asking questions, to never dismiss their instincts, and to believe that even the most tightly buried secrets could surface. Helen also worked with a local group that helped fund searches for long-missing children. She donated some of George's pension to support forensic technology efforts, wanting to turn something dark into something that could shine a light. She didn't call it redemption. She didn't believe what George had done could be balanced out or made right. But she believed in reclaiming power, one step, one story at a time. Her own story became something of a cautionary tale, but also a symbol of endurance. People were drawn to the quiet strength in her voice, to the unimaginable weight she had carried and survived. They listened not out of morbid curiosity, but because her story reminded them that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor, a husband, a father in time. The town of Cedar Falls came to see Helen differently, not just as a widow, not just as a mother of a missing child, but as someone who had walked through a darkness deeper than most could imagine and emerged on the other side, carrying not just pain but purpose. And as spring arrived, bringing soft rains and the first signs of green, Helen found herself planting flowers in the garden once again. Not because she had forgotten, not because the grief had disappeared, but because life, somehow, still asked to be lived. Each bloom was a quiet promise. The truth had come, and with it, the chance to begin again.